Okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming today to talk with Adam Elliott-Cooper and Derica Purnell about Adam's new book, Black Resistance to British Policing. So the structure is we'll have around a 45-minute conversation between Derica and Adam, and then we'll open it up to a general Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question, you can feel free to just put it in the chat or raise your hand once that time comes. But I'll introduce our distinguished speakers first. Derica Purnell is a lawyer, organizer, and the author of the forthcoming book, Becoming Abolitionist: Police, Protest, and the Pursuit of Freedom. Adam Elliott-Cooper is a research associate in sociology at the University of Greenwich and an incoming lecturer of politics at Queen Mary's University. He received his PhD from the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford in 2016 and has held research posts at UCL Department of Philosophy and King College London's Department of Geography. His first book, Black Resistance to British Policing, is currently available in the US for pre-order, due for release in the end of May. This book details the activism that made movements like Black Lives Matter possible. It analyzes racism beyond prejudice and the interpersonal, arguing that Black resistance confronts a global system of racial classification, exploitation, and violence. This is a book about resistance, considering Black liberation movements in the 20th century, while utilizing a decade of activist research covering spontaneous rebellion, campaigns, and protests in the 21st century. So with that, I would like to welcome Derica and Adam, and thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today.
Of course, thank you so much for the invitation. Adam, how are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling excited. Yeah, thanks so much to Victoria and everyone at UCLA for the invitation, and obviously to you, Derica, as well, for agreeing to speak with me today.
Yeah, of course, I'm honored. Thank you for everyone who decided to join another Zoom. Do y'all know what senioritis is? Do y'all have senioritis in Britain?
I don't think so.
Senioritis is this concept when you're getting ready to graduate, like at the end of a term, and you don't want to do the assignments, but you want to graduate. And so it's just this horrible last like 3 weeks of school where you're just like, oh my gosh, get me out of here. So I feel like people are in Zoom senioritis right now. And so I always find it quite magical and just wonderful that people are continuing to show up online to do these events. And I'm so happy that the people who are here today. So yeah, let's jump in. So how did this book come to be right now, this particular moment?
It's quite a long story. Well, it's a story that's almost 10 years old, which is makes me feel very old, and maybe makes the book feel slightly more grand than perhaps it is. But it's a book that began way before I joined academia, a book that began when I was working as a youth worker in an area of northeast London called Hackney. And I was always interested in engaging a lot of the young people that I worked with in political issues, questions of class, race, gender, these types of things. And so if I tried to talk to them about class, they'd be like, oh, come off all that stuff, I don't want to hear about all of that stuff. Or if I tried to talk about racism, they'd be like, oh, stop going on about all that black stuff all the time, Adam, don't want to hear that all the time. And it was always policing, which was one of the main issues that really galvanized interest among the young people that I was working with. So many of them had experiences themselves or their friends or their families or somebody in their community who experienced violence or harassment or neglect at the hands of the police. And it was a really powerful avenue into wider conversations of racism and class that I began to get interested in, not necessarily because I thought it was the most interesting or urgent issue politically for the people in my communities, but it was certainly the avenue through which we could have wider political conversations, and certainly the issue which galvanized a great number of people. And so it was from that period of 2010, 2011, that I began to start becoming involved in more kinds of community organizing, particularly following the police killing of a young black man called Mark Duggan in 2011, and the civil unrest which swept across the country in the days that followed, and becoming involved in a lot of the kind of organizing that was necessary to defend the community from the increase in stops and searches and raids and arrests that was taking place. And it was here that I realized that a lot of people were quite dismissive of these urban rebellions and didn't really see a kind of political efficacy to them, whereas I saw not simply the kind of community organizing and youth work that was taking place as a prelude to it, but also a huge galvanization of community organizing which emerged out of it as well. And I was trying to think about these more formalized forms of Black organizing in conversation with these more spontaneous rebellions. So I guess that's the moment in which I kind of began writing about this topic as a series of blog articles, really, before I decided to formalize that research at the university.
Oh, wow. Yes. I remember that section in the book, just in the introduction, with you talking to these youth workers. And one thing that it made very clear is that, it's not capitalists who are coming to pull you over, right? It's not capitalists who are patting you down. It's not capitalists who are raiding your blocks or deporting your family. It's the cops, right? And so there's that. Even though you and I understand cops to be these managers of inequality, the people who are protecting capitalism, who are keeping imperialism in place, that's not who's pulling you over right now. And so you make it so clear in the beginning of the book, like, this is who people are coming to contact with. It's not a corporation, right? It's not Jeff Bezos. It's like the person who's on your block. It's the Bobby. It's the person who you are fighting against. That's what's in the music. That's what's on the television. And I find that so important, because at least in the United States, there's so much antagonism towards policing for a lot of the same reasons. And then what often gets missed is that police are protecting this very violent sets of systems. And what you do brilliantly throughout the book is show how all of these Black activists and all of these Black organizers are actually criticizing or fighting these other systems too, right? So we see labor union organizing, we see organizing against white mobs, we see so much activism against these structures, and police are there in the way. And so now Black people are not only fighting these imperialist capitalist structures, they also now have to fight police. And I thought that the book did an excellent job of doing that. One of my favorite things, because I'm usually on the other side of this, is when you talk about in the book how, people in Britain will say, well, we're not America. America is really racist. Come on, you see those videos go viral. You see Black Lives Matter emerging under the first Black president. You see all of these people on their bellies, on their backs, screaming for help. We see the travel advisory warnings from the Bahamas saying, hey, if you're a Black person, don't go to the US. Clearly, that's not us. And so what do you say when that conversation happens and you get to met out the differences between American racism and British racism?
So, as I'm sure many people are aware, Britain has this this self-image it likes to project to the world. This place where we don't really do race here in Britain. We do class. We love the class system. We love the class system so much. We've still got a royal family. We love class so much. We've basically still got the remnants of feudalism. We love class so much. But of course, what it also does is creates the impression that race is therefore this thing that happens somewhere else, right? Race is this thing that happens in America. It used to happen in South Africa, but everything's probably fine now. But over here in Britain, we do class. And what this requires is what some scholars call a colonial amnesia. Because of course, it's not a coincidence that people in both the United States and South Africa, the two places where racism happens, speak English. It's not because of some quirk of history or some osmosis or something, or just because English is objectively the best language in the world, which is why everyone probably speaks it in all these different corners of the planet. So the other thing that a lot of people say when they say, racism is this thing that happens in America, the way they explain it away is because our histories are so different. Right? America had slavery. America had had this settler colonial project. America had segregation, had all of these things. Right? We didn't have that here in Britain, and I guess that is a profound lie by omission, because of course Britain did, of course, have slavery. Not only did it have slavery, it was the largest slave trading nation in human history. Exactly. Britain did have a settler colonial project. In fact, it had settler colonial projects all over the planet, from Australia and New Zealand to Southern Africa to, of course, North America and the Caribbean. Britain, of course, did have segregation. It had segregation in Kenya and Rhodesia and South Africa, and it had an informal colour bar here on the British mainland. So it had all of these different, it had the very same forms of racial governance that the United States had. But because it didn't do them on the British mainland, it's able to create the impression that it didn't have them at all. And so one of the things I really wanted to do in the book was to force Britain to confront that, that colonial history, that wider international global history, which I think is so crucially fundamental for understanding the history of policing, but more importantly, or equally as importantly, policing today. And so while on the one hand, we can say, of course, there are material differences between policing in the United States and policing in Britain, the way in which they're both historically constituted through colonial racism are very similar to each other. But so when we look at policing today in comparison to the United States, again, of course, it's very different. The violence and the racial violence of the settler colony is, of course, going to be different to the violence of the old core, right? The old center of empire. But there are many, I think, quite similar parallels that we could point to. One is the fact that here in Britain, Britain incarcerates Black people at the same rates as the United States incarcerates African Americans. Around 25% of our prison population are people of color, despite constituting only about 13% of the general population. And our youth population of incarcerated people, I think almost 50% of them are children of color. So hugely disproportionate in that regard. And we can also see the ways in which Britain polices its borders and enforces what we call the hostile environments policy to police migrants or suspected migrants and undocumented peoples in a way that's comparable to the US. We can see the Terrorism Act in the criminalisation of Muslim communities or perceived Muslim communities. We can see the policing of gangs and this racial folk devil of Black people, and Black men in particular, being this violent threat to the order of society. A whole swathe of similarities. So while we can point to the fact, of course, point to the fact that there are clear differences in the US in terms of the quantitative figures in how many people are dying, on how many people are being arrested, and how many people are being incarcerated, I think there is far more in common. And I think perhaps we should be unsurprised by that, given the so-called special relationship that Britain and the United States have historically.
Yes. In addition to all of that, so much of policing in the US has been borrowed from the colonization of the Irish people under Britain, right? And so that model of policing has been exported not only to the US, but in places like Pakistan and India and other British colonial former territories. And so you see the exportation of British policing, and then it's like, oh, wait, that's not us. And it's like, well, actually, it is you, like a lot of the times, historically, right? Those remnants of colonial policing. And so on our side, what a lot of police reform advocates would say is just that we can be Britain. Look, they kill way fewer than 1,000 people every year. Like, that's the goal. Like, how do we get there? But then Britain becomes the measuring stick for some form of de-racialized policing and better interactions, because there's less killings, right? There's less killings. But they want to do that and still somehow keep all of their guns and say, we can take guns from police, but not deal with the fact that there are more guns in the US than there are people, right? And so there's this interesting, like, the give and take of, we can be like Britain and, oh, we're not like America on the other side.
It's interesting. Yeah, I think that a lot of certain kinds of reformists say similar things in Britain, but they say, oh, why can't we be more like the Netherlands or like Norway or like Sweden, for instance. I think certainly the Netherlands, because they have a kind of colonial history and therefore have a more of a multicultural or multi-ethnic population, not dissimilar to Britain, and lots of large urban conurbations. But of course, the logic of policing is still the same, right? Which is what you kind of mentioned before, the logic of policing, of protecting property, of disciplining organized labor, of making sure that oppressed people remain in the hierarchical order as it currently exists.
Adam, so I know the people in the audience don't know this, but Adam and I met in the Netherlands in 2015. I was on there on a fellowship, and I don't know if you even know this, Adam, but during my fellowship there with Niall, we met with like chief commanders of the Dutch police, like in Amsterdam. And what they told us is that, oh, no, we're not like America. We actually have arranged our police so that there is a captain of Caribbean descent who goes out when there are protests, and we make sure that's the person who comes into contact with the angry people from Curacao. And, you know, so I was like, yeah, that sounds a little bit colonial, that you send someone out who represents the Caribbean background. So that sounds a little problematic. I don't know if you want to like tout that as a reform, but that's such a good point, that British, they're looking to other former colonies to say, look, this is how this could be. Yes, wow. So I want to make sure we have enough time for the rest of the book, but the last thing I will say too, because you mentioned, you know, Britain still has the royal family, and now we have reunited countries because there's also an American, well, I guess an American who's also in the family.
There certainly is.
There certainly is. And so welcome back, brother, in case you know. And I don't know if you saw this interview, but during her interview with Oprah, I remember her saying that I thought that the British Crown would be excited to have a woman of color and a grandchild of color in the family, because look of all of people in the Commonwealth. And it's like, well, like you said, they're in the Commonwealth not by accident, right?
Precisely. I think they forgot to mention that the Commonwealth is a hierarchical institution in which the people of colour are at the bottom and the white royal family are at the top. So, and that hierarchy is obviously fundamental to the royal family's power. And so disrupting that, even with the kind of tokenized, acceptable face of blackness, it would still ruffle feathers, to say the least.
Well, can you talk more about that? Because you also address that in the book, that look, if we can just get more people of representation, more people of color, more diverse government representation, more diverse business representation, this is how we can change the face of Britain and, you know, respond to all of the horrible accusations of racism and discrimination that people of color face. Can you talk about some of those anti-racist liberal reforms that you mentioned in the early part of the book?
Yeah, sure. So not dissimilar to the United States, I guess. Britain's kind of liberal anti-racist tradition treats its institutions as if they are objective, fair, just, empty vessels in which you can pour anti-racist policies and anti-racist people into these, you know, objective empty vessels, or you can pour, which has been done in the past for some reason that we don't really know, some people who have biases, unconscious or otherwise, and policies which seem to discriminate for some reason that we're not quite sure, but for some reason it's happened. And so what this kind of liberal interpretation of these institutions does is it opens the door for people to say, well, let's just keep these same institutions, but let's change the people who work there, maybe by giving them some kind of training or education in relation to racism. And of course, let's try to diversify the management. But what, of course, that does is I guess there's a couple of things it does. The first thing that's really important is it dehistoricizes these institutions. Mm-hmm. It fails to acknowledge the fact that these institutions are colonially constructed, both in Britain and in the United States. And therefore, the disciplining of colonized populations, be they Black and Indigenous peoples and other communities of color in the US, or the range of different colonized populations under the control of the British Empire, means that in order for these institutions to exist and reproduce their power, they have to reproduce racial governance. They have never existed without racial governance. That is the only way in which they can operate. And so what a radical critique of this process would say, and when I say radical, I mean, I guess Angela Davis kind of paraphrases Karl Marx when she says, grabbing things at the roots. If we look at the root of these institutions and note that they are colonially constituted, then we realize that we have to therefore dismantle them and develop new institutions, different institutions, which are not rooted in colonial power. And so the efforts, therefore, by these kind of liberal interpretations of anti-racism, which seek only to reform these institutions, but keep them, but not completely dismantle them, has I think, done very, very little to change the material reality and material existence, tangible experiences of Black and other oppressed peoples when it comes to, as we talk about today, police and prisons. And all it does, of course, is in fact legitimize these institutions by demonstrating that they're more progressive than maybe other countries or regions. So they've got these great trainers and consultants in. They're more progressive than other countries or regions because they've got people of colour in greater positions of power, and what have you. And or they're more progressive because they've got community consultative committees or other forms of so-called accountability and democratic transparency. And so all of these things don't simply seek to not deal with racism, they actually reinforce the power of these institutions by affording them greater legitimacy in the eyes of its liberal democratic advocates. And this is something that I'm sure that I know has happened a great deal in the United States. Of course, the rise of Barack Obama is no greater example than that, but it's certainly something that's happened here in Britain to a lesser degree. And the Conservative Party have been very, very good at that. They've got a Home Secretary and a Chancellor who are both people of colour, and the main representatives for a number of their other policies have been people of colour as well. So they've been doing this game very to great effect in recent years, and has on the one hand, I think, reinforced and helped to legitimize these kinds of racist policies. But I think also, and maybe this is something we can talk about a little bit later, I think really crucially, has also demonstrated that liberal anti-racism is not going to end racism, and has actually blown open for everyone the reality that these kinds of reforms, whether it be Barack Obama in the US or people of colour in Britain's government cabinet, aren't going to bring about the kinds of changes that liberal anti-racists promised it would. And we need a different kind of politics if we're going to make the changes that we so desperately need.
Yes. With Barack Obama and now with Vice President Kamala Harris, like you literally see both. Oh my gosh, wow. Okay, so from this point right here, what you illuminate in the book is that there are different traditions of anti-racist organizing, right? There's different traditions of anti-racism, period. And in the US, we talk about it a bit differently. People see anti-racism, it has entered the mainstream and such. I mean, in the last year and a half, the anti-racism discourse has dominated the mainstream. But what your book shows is that, well, not all anti-racism is good anti-racism, right? There's liberal anti-racism that retrench problems. And then there's this grassroots resistance anti-racism, which seeks to undermine these institutions of oppression. And you have this claim in the book that I think is a pretty bold claim. So I'm going to quote you instead of trying to paraphrase it. You say that Black resistance to policing is necessarily anti-capitalist and internationalist. And so I want to know about that tradition of anti-racism, which is not the liberal tradition, but that tradition of anti-racism. And then how do you define resistance? If this is the case, then tell me what your definition of resistance is.
So I think that anti-racism is necessarily anti-capitalist because it is through capitalism that racism becomes tangible. It's through racism it's through capitalism that racism becomes material. Right? So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that without the power of capital, so economic exploitation and other forms of, on all the things that capitalism is able to produce, like guns and prisons and tanks and all of these other things, racism is simply an idea. It can only become something which can be enforced through the power of capitalism and the state's management of those of the material things that capitalism is able to produce. And so that's why I think it's really crucial for us to appreciate the importance of understanding the politics of class as well as the politics of race. In relation to internationalism, I think that's crucial as well, because of course capitalism doesn't exist within state borders. It doesn't, and neither does race, and therefore neither does racism. And so therefore, with one group of Black people in one polity or region or nation state is never going to be free of racism unless other Black peoples are free as well. And this is, so I think there is a kind of a strategic mode to this argument, but I think there's also a moral and political one as well. which is that we should not understand our freedom to be somehow separate from the freedom of other oppressed peoples on other parts of the planet as well. And so I think there is something strategic as well as something moral political about the importance of internationalism. And I think there's something strategic as well as something moral and political about the importance of class and capitalism as well, because there are people, because poor white people are also oppressed by capitalism, and we have to therefore understand, I think, that if racism and capitalism are fundamentally linked together, then we have to, and therefore if we're resisting racism means that we also have to resist capitalism, then we also have to bring all people oppressed by capitalism with us. And that includes white people as well as peoples of color. And that's why I find the importance of understanding anti-capitalism and internationalism as being so fundamentally important to anti-racism. In relation to what resistance looks like, I mean, unfortunately, there's no blueprint for resistance. But some of the things I try to do in the book are to look through some of the examples that are taking place, from educational projects with young people, to legal campaigns with movement lawyers, to grassroots protests and demonstrations, to spontaneous urban rebellions, or a whole swathe of different forms of resistance, which I think are really crucial, some of which are, I think, in a very formal sense, generally understood as being political, and some which I think are too often overlooked as not necessarily being political. And one of the things I really try to do is draw the connections between these different forms of struggle.
Yes, amazing. One such example is about families. I've been growing so much more interested and eager in learning about the history of family organizing, especially around police violence. And I've, since 2014, since Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, what has happened is that every time now there's a police killing that goes viral, because it's not every police killing in the US, the police kill about 3 people a day. We see a handful of those videos go viral. And then the ones that are unarmed typically get the most amount of attention and sympathy. But what will often happen after a police killing is that the city officials fear that there's going to be a rebellion. They get to the family, there's some set of conversations, usually with lawyers who will, just to be quite frank, will stand to make some profit from civil suits. And then the family will come out, and then the city will come out, and they will say, don't dishonor the person who's killed by the police. Please respect what the family wants. And what I've noticed is that respecting what the family wants only matters to city officials when what the family wants, or at least has to say that they want for the purposes of the civil suit, is peace. And then what does that do? Automatically pits organizers and activists and people pouring in the streets against the families and against the honor and the memory of the person who was killed by the state. And there's been such a shift there that I've been hoping people will write about. Shifts from like the 40s to the 80s, radical Black mothers. I'm thinking about the daughter of Eleanor Bumpurs, who was killed in New York. Her family launched the Eleanor Bumpurs Justice Committee to organize poor, welfare, project living tenants against landlords, against police violence. Like, there are all these historical legacies of police activism with families. And now today, the shift has really become around foundations, GoFundMes, what the family wants, please don't protest. And you have this incredible chapter where you talk about the legacy of families' resistance. And so it would be great if you could talk about some of the demands that families wanted. What were some of their fights, and how do you situate that with some of the organizing that you're seeing today?
Yeah, I think the first point you made is really interesting, actually, which I don't talk about too much in the book, but I think it's worth revisiting, which is the fact that the state has this idea of a certain form of freedom and rights and liberties, but they are the freedom of the individual, and they are the rights of the individual. And therefore, these institutions can only really comprehend the rights and freedoms of the individual. And that individual is, in this case, the individual who's been killed at the hands of the police. And therefore, they only have the capacity to deal with racism on that individual level. Whereas, of course, for these community organizations, they understand freedom as being, and they understand rights as being collective rights, collective freedom. So when they see this specific instance of police racism, they understand it as being in this wider context of racial violence, in this collective oppression of Black and other racialized peoples. And I think it's the tension between these two notions of freedom, or these two notions of liberty, that I think we see this tension arising in many of these family campaigns. So I think, not dissimilar to what I mentioned before, I think there are strategic as well as moral and political reasons why the family have been quite such a consistent site of struggle, of Black struggle against policing. One of them, I think, is the strategic side. I think it enables a lot of these protest groups to access sections of the media and sections of the community as well, who might not necessarily be open to engaging in dialogue from people who identify as activists, right? A grieving parent or a grieving family member, I think, articulates a certain level of not necessarily sympathy, but also, I think, sometimes rage on the part of people who are listening to someone who's lost somebody close to them. And so I think that a lot of these family members appreciates the power that they have in being able to go into a place of worship, or a community centre, or a protest, or a media outlet, or speak to someone in a position of power and articulate their demands as a grieving family member, right? In addition to simply being an activist. I think the other thing that it does is it pushes back against a wave of different forms of racist ideas about the Black family. Mm-hmm. One of them, crucially, is the idea that Black families are these chaotic places which are absent of love and care, and all of the things that are in a normative way might associate with family. And I think pushing back on these kinds of stereotypes, particularly about projects onto Black women, I think further empowers many of these campaigns. But I think the other thing that it does, which is really, I think, even more crucial, is it expands the notion of the family. Mm-hmm. It doesn't limit the family to this nuclear heteronormative construct, which was basically invented in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, and imposed on many colonized populations who more often lived in extended family networks and non-nuclear family units. And in a comparable way, in a similar way, these family campaigns don't simply understand themselves in a kind of nuclear family structure as being what constitutes the family. They understand that the family campaigns they are involved in extend across their communities, across different oppressed peoples. And so groups like the United Family and Friends campaign, who I talk about in the book, and I've worked with for a number of years, have this conception of the family that goes beyond this kind of narrow heteronormative nuclear conception of the family, and articulate the family in a more kind of radical politics, I think. And I think for that reason, again, the use of the notion of family for these Black community organisations is so crucial for us to understand how Black politics is being articulated and what kinds of racisms they're pushing up against, multiple different racisms, pretty much at the same time.
Yeah, yes, and if there is any levels of serious chaos within Black families, it is the legacies of racism, colonialism, state violence that disrupts, right, the Black family, and the pieces that people organize with the pieces to try to hold it together. Now, I love when you talk about the Black family so much, not just, like, as you say, as a site of oppression, but also as a site of resistance in the political category. Another group you sort of do that with are gang members. And I mean, that chapter was so important for lots of reasons. One, because people don't take people who are involved in gangs as like serious, legitimate political actors with like rights to like self-defend and to be antagonistic towards the state who constantly attacks them. It made me think about the riots after the video of Rodney King went viral in LA, and how police targeted gang members who were undocumented, who participated in the rebellions, to deport them, right? So you see, like, even in the wake of Black rebellion, where people of different races, different backgrounds are in solidarity, resisting police violence is used as a measure of surveillance and targeting and deportation. So I would love if you could talk about how gangs fall outside that political category of people who should be protected, and then what sorts of resistance have you talked about either in your organizing or in the book?
Yeah, definitely. So there's an interesting history of gangs, I suppose, which speaks to the US, but also speaks to British history more directly. Britain began using the term gangs in, I guess, the 1930s and 40s, as far as I can tell, in its colonies, even though it's a term that's much older than that. To, I guess, discredit or delegitimize anti-colonial movements in places like Kenya, where the anti-colonial movements there were described as terror gangs, or in places like Malaya, where they were described as communist terror gangs. And so we see this discourse of gangs being used a great deal in Britain's colonies to, as I mentioned, dehumanize people engaged in forms of resistance. We see it really transposed in the British context, I guess, at the beginnings of the 21st century. And it's kind of borrowed, it has this longer historical lineage, but it's certainly something which is being popularized in the United States. And it sees British politicians and the press are able to kind of seize on this image of the dangerous Black man as being a gang member, and transplant it here in Britain. And impose it on Black communities here in the UK. And I guess there are a number of ways in which we see politics arising here, and maybe thinking of two of them might be useful. The first are the ways in which people involved in urban rebellion following the police killing of Mark Duggan in 2011, which I mentioned earlier, are framed as gang members by the police, by politicians, by the press. And following that, David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, declares what he calls an all-out war on gangs and gang culture. And because of the kind of imagery that's associated with gangs, everybody knew what he meant by this. I think in the US, you'd probably call this something like dog whistle racism, right? But the other thing that's very political about the way in which we see gangs policed are the ways in which we see their attempts to erode their civil liberties. And this is something which is happening really on the kind of the cutting edge of policing today. And saying that even if they're not inciting violence, they should be interpreted as inciting violence, even if they talk about violence in the abstract, as is often done in film and theatre and other forms of artistic expression. Even if they are talking about violence in the abstract, because these people are gang members, we should interpret it as actually inciting violence and therefore impose criminal sanctions. And we also see it in the ways in which so-called gang members are policed in relation to injunctions. So eroding their civil liberties, preventing them from going to certain places, speaking to certain people, using social media, a whole swathe of different impositions on their freedoms and their rights. And so while we can't necessarily, while it might be difficult to say that all forms of so-called gang affiliation are necessary or are forms of political resistance to the state, the ways in which we see the state responding to these formations are very political indeed. They are historically constituted through colonialism. The manner in which the governments see this need to intervene and introduce new forms of state power, and the ways in which not simply stops and searches and arrests and incarceration is used, but new forms of the erosion of liberties and the attempts to prevent freedom of expression. All of these types of things demonstrate a very kind of political approach to these kinds of formations. And I think that one of the things this helps us to think about is the manner in which understanding the policing of so-called gangs in Britain can help us to understand not simply how people are resisting the kinds of environments and the kinds of policing that they are engaged in, but the way in which the state in countries like Britain, but also the US, police political dissidents and so-called criminals in very, very similar ways. And the connection between the policing of political dissidents and people who are criminalized in less political, capital P ways, I think helps us to break down this false dichotomy between political prisoners over here and so-called non-political prisoners somewhere else.
Yes, no, completely brilliant. Absolutely. I mean, in the US, lots of people, I would imagine that lots of people know by now, COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, government infiltration. But years before COINTELPRO, there was the ghetto informant program, where the police relied on the exploitation of petty thieves, petty criminals, people who have records, and put them in exploitative positions to gain intel, not just on radical Black organizations, but all sorts of sectors of Black life. So yeah, that category is so important. Just not, finding that dichotomy is so important because it's going to maximize the amount of people we can keep safe. I would love to read you a quote really quickly based on breaking up this dichotomy, and I'll let you guess the person. If we're honest with ourselves, we'll admit that during the course of 50 years, there were times when some of us claiming to push for change lost our way. The anguish of assassination set off self-defeating riots. Legitimate grievances against police brutality tipped into excuse making for criminal behavior. Racial politics could cut both ways, as the transformative message of unity and brotherhood was drowned out by the language of recrimination. And what had been once a call for equality and opportunity, the chance for all Americans to work hard and get ahead, was too often framed as a mere desire for government support, as if we had no agency in our own liberation, as if poverty was an excuse to not raise your children, and the bigotry of others was the reason to give up on yourself. All of that history is how progress stalled. That's how hope was diverted. And it's how our country remained divided.
Oh, well, that's got to be someone like Barack Obama, doesn't it?
It's Barack Obama. 500 points. The reason why there's so much racial oppression today is because during the 60s, during the movements for Black liberation, some Black people threw some bottles, and that's why racism remains today. So pitiful. Those Black criminals. This is our history in a nutshell.
I know. Why can't we just be pure? Why can't we be pure? It's the lack of purity that's the issue.
No, it's hard. It's so hard. It's hard out here. So Adam, we are getting close to Q&A. The last chapter in your book, you talk about the futures of Black resistance. You talk about defund and abolition. Where is that in Britain? Where is that in the international context? And what should we be most excited about? What's coming our way?
So I think that while the politics of abolition certainly isn't new to Britain, and I've recently been coming across old journals of abolition, which were published in the 1980s, mainly by...
Inquest. Have you seen the ones at Inquest?
Yes, the ones at Inquest, exactly, yeah. So this kind of politics certainly isn't new to Britain, but I would say it's certainly been popularised or maybe repopularised since the protests in the summer of 2020. And while, of course, the context in Britain is slightly different to the United States, the discourse around defunding the police has certainly proliferated a great deal. And I mean, I'm not going to go into the boring technicalities of how police and prisons are funded differently to the United Kingdom, but the general, to the US, but the general sentiment that our prison and police system is hugely over-resourced, hugely bloated, and that the kinds of reforms that we should be thinking about should be reforms which erode society's reliance on police and prison power, erode the resources that police and prisons have, and erode how much money is pumped into them. And those resources and that power, as well as that money, should be used to empower community-led solutions to safety and harm reduction, whether it be through mental health provision, or services for people who use drugs problematically, or trade union organising to defend people's jobs, or services for survivors of domestic violence, or youth provision, a whole swathe of different kinds of community-led initiatives. These ideas have certainly been at the forefront of the more, I guess, radical elements of the protest movements that began in the summer of 2020, to the point where, of course, our politicians aren't necessarily absorbing and agreeing to these kinds of demands, but they're being forced to engage with them for the first time, even if they are forced to engage with them so they have to attempt to refute them, which is something actually quite difficult to do, because the evidence is so overwhelming that Britain's prison population, which has almost doubled since the early 1990s, in fact, our women's prison population has more than doubled since the 1990s, has been a total failure, even on its own terms, with regard to improving community safety and reducing harm. That they've been politicians have been, I guess, ambushed somewhat by certain sections of the press in their attempts to acknowledge that the police and prison system aren't keeping people safe, yet at the same time we need more police officers, we need to build more prisons, and we need to make sure that law and order is taken seriously. And both political parties are kind of fighting with each other to be the party of law and order. But what I think is what's really beautiful for me that's taken place since those protests of 2020, and we began to see the mainstreaming of arguments of defunding the police and abolitionist visions of a world in which prisons and police are obsolete, is the way in which it is spread way beyond the movements for Black lives, the anti-racist mobilizations of 2020. Mm-hmm. So over the last 2 or 3 months here in Britain, we've seen a number of really spectacular mobilizations against state power and police in prisons. One of them has been led by a group called Sisters Uncut, which is a group of women and non-binary people who organised a whole wave of protests following a killing of a woman called Sarah Everard, who was killed by a police officer, kidnapped and killed by a police officer, and her body was found earlier this year, which some more liberal groups tried to use her death to demand more kind of liberal reforms, such as turning gender-based violence into a hate crime, in which would of course reinforce prison and police solutions to gender-based violence, and instead followed an abolitionist agenda and said, this isn't an aberration for the police. This isn't a diversion from the normal functioning of policing. Policing is patriarchal, and if we want to defeat patriarchy, we have to defeat policing. But what we've seen emerge out of their movement is a wider coalition against a new bill which is being introduced in Britain called now if I'm trying to remember, it's called the Policing, Crime, Evidence and Sentencing Bill, which has a whole swathe of reforms that include criminalising all process, which is interpreted as being disruptive or noisy, imposing new forms of injunctions, which will force healthcare professionals and teachers and other people in public services to basically work as police officers, identifying signs of radicalisation or gang affiliation or being undocumented among the people who access services from them, but also criminalise Gypsy Roma traveller communities as well, who are among some of the most oppressed people across Europe, with very high mortality rates, very high incarceration rates, very high school exclusion rates, and again criminalising their way of life. And so a huge coalition of Gypsy Roma traveller groups, Black organisations, feminist organisations, trade union groups, and other civil liberties organisations have all come together in what's called the Kill the Bill Coalition to challenge not simply this specific bill criminalising protest as well as oppressed people's lives, but also on an abolitionist agenda, saying that this problem of policing shouldn't be isolated to this specific bill, but should be understood as the normal functioning of our police and prison system. And therefore our demands shouldn't be simply the erosion or the scrapping of this bill, but should be the erosion of police and prison power and scrapping both these institutions altogether. And the fact that we haven't seen 2021 as being the year of feminism and 2020 being the year of Black politics, but actually both of these years has been the years of abolition, I think has been one of the most powerful things that's happened in this country in my lifetime. And I think we're only seeing the movement for abolition snowball and galvanize more and more people into this vision. And I can't see it stopping. And I think that's one of the most amazing things that's happened since I stopped writing the book, which I had to do eventually, because the movement wasn't stopping for anyone.
Right. Wow. Yes. Yes. Let's offline talk more about Kill the Bill, because there's stuff going on in Florida and Missouri literally around the same bill. Oh my gosh. So hype. I just dropped a link in the chat. I've read 2 books that cover Black resistance and Black rebellion in the wake of police violence. And I read lots of books about policing, lots of books about state violence. There are very, very, very few books that cover resistance and rebellion, and even fewer that cover them in the internationalist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist perspective. So please, please, please do yourself a favor, read this book, read it with other people, read it in your political education, read it to get free, read it in your spare time. Very, very serious about it. It's such a contribution to the archives, like some of the stories that he told in this book. It's such a contribution to organizers, to activists, people who care about social justice. It gives us legacies of resistance from the Caribbean to the UK. It's really well done. So I know when I finished reading it, I told you, I was like, I need to rename my child. I named him after the wrong Garvey. And so I have been deeply impacted by this book, the language, the writing, the storytelling. So thank you for sharing it with us. And I'll turn it over to you, Victoria, for Q&A.
Thank you, Derica.
Great, thank you both so much for this amazing conversation. We're going to open it up to a Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question, you can feel free to raise your virtual hand or post the question in the chat. Debanjan, go ahead.
So I'm trying to figure out how to put my hand down now. Okay, here we go. So I just want to say thank you so much to both Professor Elliott-Cooper and Derica Purnell for this awesome conversation. Thank you both so much for joining us. I think it's just such a wonderful treat that we get to have Derica here, such a phenomenal, just on the ground activist, and Adam, thank you so much for your work. One thing I wanted you to speak to a little bit, I know you were getting into it before, but talk to us a little bit about impact of British policing and American imperialism and American militarism, and specifically around what we're seeing right now in Palestine, especially. I think that you would have a tremendous perspective on that. And I know we've talked in other conversations about how, you know, British policing influences American policing, American militarism and imperialism, and policing influences the world, right? You know, and that is really the colonial context. That is the colonial understanding of this. It's just to think about it not only of the minoritized and colonized populations within those nation states, but how those nation states then police the world and create, you know, a sense of you know, sort of the, you know, policing the world, really. And so, you know, Palestine, I think, is the most pressing and most urgent example of that, but we can certainly think about, you know, SARS in Nigeria. That was heavily British influenced. We can also think about, you know, border regimes in, you know, in other parts of the world as well. So without getting, you know, too much, I really just want to hear from y'all, and please feel free to take that in any direction you feel you want to, but tell us about the global perspective and how understanding the roots of empire here really helps us to understand what's going on in the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Siobhan. Yeah, it's a great one. So I think there's a number of ways in which we can think about that. I think one of them is certainly the historical component of this. So for many of Britain's most influential police officers, when I say Britain's police officers, I mean they're police officers on the British mainland. Many of them made their began their careers in Britain's colonies. So if we take, for instance, one British Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Kenneth Newman, who began his career in British mandated Palestine before 1948 and the creation of Israel, then moved to Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, in which he became in charge of passing power over or transferring power from a military police force to a civilian police force called the Royal Ulster Constabulary. And it was from his experiences in both in his purported success in both Palestine and in the north of Ireland that he was recruited to become head of the Metropolitan Police in 1981 after a series of black-led urban rebellions across that city as well as other cities in England. And it was because of his experience in the colonies that they said, okay, Kenneth Newman is this person we need to bring in. And what did Kenneth Newman bring in? He brought in those colonial forms of policing. He provided consultancy from Britain's two remaining colonies at that time, which was of course, the north of Ireland, but also Hong Kong, in order to introduce policies that included the use of CS spray and tear gas, the use of rubber bullets, the use of a technique which was basically driving an armoured vehicle into a crowd of people in a purported effort to disperse them, which led to one person being killed in Toxteth in Liverpool, mass arrests, and a whole swathe of other I guess, militarized forms of policing, these kind of counterinsurgency techniques. So we see the ways in which historically colonialism has kind of come home to roost for these black populations in the mother country. The other thing that's really crucial about, I guess, British policing is that it's counterinsurgency policing. So the policing that it did during these anti-colonial movements became a model for counterinsurgency operations throughout the world. British army generals and police chiefs and civil servants were the principal consultants to the US in places like Vietnam and places like Afghanistan. These kinds of British counterinsurgency models were really crucial. And one of the reasons for that was because Britain told the world that actually when it does counterinsurgency, it doesn't really use very much violence. It mainly focuses on what it calls hearts and minds. And so while it set up effectively concentration camps in Kenya and labor camps in Malaya and used poison gas and a whole swathe of forms of brutal violence across its colonies, what it told the rest of the world that it was doing was that it was doing a hearts and minds project, that it was running community initiatives, that it was working with people, that it was gaining its legitimacy through these forms of social and cultural infrastructure, rather than the kind of crass brutality that was associated with the French in Algiers and the failures of the violence of the US war in Vietnam. And so Britain's PR exercise in relation to counterinsurgency policing, not simply trying to do a PR exercise on the people it was colonizing by trying to tell them that they should side with the British over the anti-colonial movements, but also the PR exercise it was doing on the rest of the world, I think had a really huge impact on this idea of hearts and minds counterinsurgency, which of course has helped to shape America's approach to its occupations of places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and trying to articulate these kinds of invasions as being humanitarian interventions, rather than, of course, what we all know they in fact are. And I guess the final thing that's really crucial about that is the way in which we still see it played out today. You mentioned SARS in Nigeria, and that's a really crucial one, because of course, Britain being able to present itself as this civilized police force, which uses a very minimum of violence and mainly relies on the consent of the community, has enabled it to, of course, provide policing consultancy and equipment and other forms of military technology to governments all over its former colonies and other parts of the world. And the SARS, which is the very notorious armed police wing in Nigeria, are one of the institutions which has, I don't want to use the word benefited, but has certainly capitalized on British policing consultancy. And so both their weapons and their training has been hugely influenced and supported by Britain. So we continue to see these colonial legacies shaping not simply the different ways in which police brutality continues to proliferate across the world, but I think really crucially, and this is one of the reasons we know about these connections, it connects our struggles of resistance as well. And when people are resisting policing in Nigeria, as they are and certainly were in huge numbers in 2020, not only were they talking about the brutality of their own governments, but they were understanding it in this international context, connecting the ways in which these forms of police brutality are not only connected to what's taking place in Britain, but are in fact British forms of brutality, both historically and contemporary and in this contemporary moment. And so when people were mobilizing in the central London against for these Black Lives Matter mobilizations, chanting that the UK is not innocent, they were also mobilizing outside the Nigerian embassy, connecting these movements of resistance. And so I think that the international nature of British policing that serves this kind of double role of simultaneously connecting these different forms of racial power, but crucially as well, connecting our struggles of resistance as well in more and more coherent ways.
Yeah, I can add to
Very
that.
well said. Thank you so much.
Well, I don't have to.
No, please. Sorry.
I was just going to add to that really, really quickly, because that history is so important, especially the counterinsurgency training. So now there are all these memes on social media of people sharing Nelson Mandela quotes about his in South Africa solidarity with Palestinian people. And that history just doesn't come because South Africa was under an apartheid, right? The South African police force was trained by and set up with Israeli assistance. So the students who were shot down the 1976 Soweto uprising, the specific unit that shut them down was the riot unit. So we read the Truth and Reconciliation documents that came at the end of apartheid. What you see is all of these confessions about what these trainings looked like between people in Argentina and Italy, how France was still, was still figuring out how to make good on all of its military occupations of North Africa. And then you have these confessions about how the riot union was set up in different parts of the country with the help of Israeli assistance. And specifically the recruits from those training programs, they were drawn from the counterinsurgency training. And the person who was over the police department who said, kill those kids, this colonel was from that counterinsurgency program, Colonels Swain Powell. And so it wasn't as if Mandela's like, we're under apartheid, they're under apartheid. The people who were responsible for fighting the students who were uprising were also trained. They were in solidarity with the people who were freshly confiscating land, right, in a fresh war with Egypt, who were fighting similar occupation, who were trying to maintain those similar occupations. And so it's sometimes memes and sharing things online would just flatten all of that history, but it's like, no, how do we make sure that we talk about these colonial manifestations that people are still resisting today? So when they invoke Nelson Mandela, we're also remembering that history, that what he was up against, what the people of South Africa was up against, and how those trainings have impacted each other.
Yeah, and I think that the Palestine solidarity movement has been so successful in drawing those links between countries in like the United States and Europe and connecting it to what's happening in Palestine today. I think they've been so powerful. It's been really a lot of work, but really crucial connections have been made by the Palestinian solidarity movement in demonstrating those connections, because they're not always as clear and as open as they might be, but they're really powerful and really crucial for us to better understand the connections of both these forms of oppression and these collective struggles.
Adam, we have another question in the chat, which is, hi, Dr. Elliott-Cooper. Do you believe people of color will ever be able to reclaim their bodies and lives before these colonial systems are dismantled?
Thanks for that question, Grace. I think it's what's really crucial. One of the things I do try to explore in the book is that simply because we're living in a system which is defined by what we might call racial capitalism, it doesn't mean that we are completely living in a totalitarian system of domination and control. There are always places and spaces in which we produce freedom, in which we produce liberation for ourselves. Right? Whether it's through culture or socializing, or whether it be in those moments of demonstration and uprising and organizing, whether it be in our community spaces or our places of worship or our places of community education. All of these places, for me, are places in which we are able to reclaim our bodies and reclaim our lives. We can't do it. I think it says we don't do it in a totality, right? Of course, we know that simply because we're enjoying that moment of carnival and festivity and of learning and of love, we still have to go back to our real lives eventually. These periods, these moments of resistance and of culture, I think are really crucial to appreciate that we do have agency over our lives. The oppression that we're living isn't a totality. It doesn't control us 100%, right? And that's so, I think, fundamental for us to not lose hope and feel despondent, but also to demonstrate what we can achieve and what we have been achieving. And so we will not be fully free, of course, until these colonial systems are dismantled, but there are always pockets and areas of liberatory spaces and ideas and connections which we make within our communities and within our societies and within our cultures. And I think it's really crucial that we celebrate those because, again, too often, I think they're not necessarily understood as being political, but I think they are crucial for our political movements.
Okay, great. I think we have time for about one more question, if anyone wants to ask the final question for today. Okay, maybe not. Well, anyways, thank you.
I have a question if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Thank you both so much for your time and your research and work. I'm doing research on Black communities, less so Black activists in the Canadian context. And so what you were talking about is in terms of the sort of liberal institutional rejection of systemic racism in the Canadian context through rhetoric or discursive comparison and juxtaposition to racism in the United States really struck a chord with me. Canada, of course, has this reputation as a sort of liberal, diverse, accepting society, and in the United States as the land of freedom for Black people in particular, right? And it really rests on this sort of image to sort of obscure systemic racism in all of its institutions, but particularly in its institution of policing. Some of the work that I do with just sort of Black residents and their sort of really levels of racial group consciousness and racial perceptions of racial solidarity within the country sort of tracked across time. And I noticed, of course, that it sort of spikes following events in the United States, right? And so to a certain extent, I'm really interested in the ways in which the attitudes of sort of, non-active Black Canadians are influenced by events in the United States, right? And what that says about Black transnationalism, the Black diaspora, so on and so forth, right? And that comment or that question about NSARS, because the Black community, both in the United Kingdom and Canada, is very is a large immigrant community, right? A relatively recent one with more direct or more recent links to places like Nigeria. It is very interesting to see the level of engagement with NSARS versus Black Lives Matter. So my question to you, Dr. Elliott-Cooper, is what can you haven't had an opportunity to read chapters of the book, and I'm thinking actually very consciously about Dr. Tiana Pechel's book on the Black social movements in Colombia and Brazil, and how movements for example, affirmative action or land reform in Colombia for Black Colombians and Black Brazilians was sort of activist driven, right? Rather than the result of a sort of mass movement, right? And so I'm kind of curious here, sort of quote unquote, beneath the level of the sort of political community activists, what can we, or what have you seen among Black Britons who are identified as West Indian or Sub-Saharan African? What can you say about levels of racial group consciousness or political solidarity or transnational solidarity? Do you see a spike in it? One of the things that I find very interesting when I speak to actually some of my colleagues in France is how aware they are of Black politics in the United States and how much they lament how unfamiliar Black Americans are of racial politics elsewhere, right? And so, you know, I'm thinking through these sort of problems, these sort of questions, and I was hoping, I guess that's a long narrative with no question, but I guess the question would be, what can you tell me about racial group consciousness and Black political solidarity among less politically active Black Britons?
Great. Thanks so much, Ayo. So I guess there's a number of things here I think you brought up where I think are really interesting. I think one of them, of course, is the importance of acknowledging that the United States is the global cultural and political hegemon, right? It's the global power in the world. And therefore, well, and not unconnected to that, I should say, Black America is the most powerful Black culture in the world, right? All over the world, the United States projects Black music, Black comedy, Black American, a whole host of different forms of Black American cultural phenomena. And it's been doing this for a very long time. Right? It was doing this during the Cold War to try to create the impression that America was this racial utopia. And I think this is one of the reasons why American news is world news, right? The American US election is an election that the entire world watches, right? For partly that reason. But this is also one of the reasons that when there are really high profile Black deaths at the hands of the police in the United States, it makes the news in other parts of the world as well. Mm-hmm. But I think it also makes the news in other parts of the world, particularly in Canada and the United States, because it of course reinforces this notion, which both you and I have mentioned, which is this idea that racism, America is this place where racism happens. And so both British and I imagine Canadian broadcasters too feel a lot more comfortable with reporting on racism in the US than they do on reporting on similar forms of police racism taking place on their own doorstep. And that's certainly been my experience here in Britain. And so therefore, unsurprisingly, we have far more people end up mobilizing in response to a US death at the hands of the police than to a UK death at the hands of the police. Even if they do die in these two instances, they will die in very similar circumstances. One will lead to the US one will lead to far greater response. And I think that's partly because of the kind of blanket coverage the British press will give to these kinds of US-based racial issues in relation to British ones. And so what took place in the summer of 2020, when the George Floyd protests emerged in Britain, were big placards that said, the UK is not innocent. And people didn't simply come to protest in solidarity with the movements in the US, but they came with placards with the names of Black and other people who'd died at the hands of Britain's police, prisons, and border regimes. And they came and didn't simply allow Britain to say, well, America has this different history to us, which is why they've got this problem of racism. People in Britain attacked statues of slave owners in cities like Bristol, which were built on the triangular trade. They attacked the statues of imperial advocates like across Parliament Square. And they, of statues of people like Winston Churchill. They protested outside the statues of Cecil Rhodes, the architect of apartheid in Southern Africa in Oxford, right? They made sure that Britain was confronted with these colonial legacies and made those kinds of connections. And so in Britain, I think, unlike Canada, all Black people in Britain have come from Britain's colonies. No, there aren't really Afro-British people or African-British Afro-British people in that kind of sense, in as far as almost pretty much all Black people in Britain are first, second, or third generation migrants, right? They all of them have come to Britain from one of Britain's African or Caribbean colonies at some point in the 20th century. And so I think this also better enables these international connections to other parts of the world, right? While of course it means that our Black experiences and our Black stories are very different to each other and perhaps less coherent than Black American communities in the United States, it certainly better enables these more disparate communities to come together and think internationally because of these still familial and cultural connections they have to their peoples back home. And I think that can be can make Black organising more difficult in Britain because of the huge differences of the different Black populations there. But I think it should also be understood as a strength as well, because it better enables us to have that international focus to our Black politics.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you all for attending, and let's give a big virtual shout out to Derica and Adam. Thank you so much for being here with us. Again, if you are intrigued by this conversation, want to learn more, please pre-order the book. It's available for pre-order now, as well as keep a lookout for Derica's book, which will also be coming out in the near future.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Derica. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Just one quick note, even if you were not intrigued by this conversation, still buy the book. Blame me. Don't blame the book. Don't blame Adam. So please, please, please purchase this book.